Episode 3 deals a lot with documents, and documents were a big part of Stanton Friedman's career. He spent a lot of time through the 1980s working on the MJ-12 document, the Cutler-Twining memo, and a number of other things. So people have to sort of have some background. As I pointed out before, it all started with the Roswell book, which was published in 1980. A bunch of government informants start to talk to people like Bill Moore and Jimmy Chandray. And the ideas start to come out that there is an MJ-12, which is a idea that there's a control group of 12 people who are given the information and control over the UFO subject, and they were responsible only to the President of the United States. So a lot of the documents that Stanton dealt with in the 1980s dealt with this whole concept of Majestic 12 and how the subject was being controlled and leaked through various people into the government. One of the documents that came out during this period of time was a document which is known as the Psalm 101 document. And it was leaked to a guy by the name of Don Berliner, who was an aviation writer. And Stan got involved in this research into, was this a legitimate document or not? And the document claimed to be a manual giving instructions on how a recovery of a craft and body is supposed to take place. So Don Berliner, who was a pretty famous aviation writer, received this anonymously in the mail, and he contacted Stanton. And as background, people have to know that there was a lot of MJ-12 documents that were being leaked in the 1980s, starting at about 1980 with the MJ-12 telex, all the way up to 2000, where a guy by the name of Tim Cooper, was receiving documents through Freedom of Information Act requests that he was making to agencies like the CIA. The total number of documents, Majestic 12 documents, there are 3,700 pages. Most people just are familiar with the MJ-12 document. There's a lot of material being leaked. This is one of the documents. And this is one of the documents that Stanton sort of got into personal trouble with it. The agreement with the document, he was given it by Don Berliner in order to try to help him verify, was this a legitimate document or was it not? So Stan was doing a lot of research, going to various archives, talking to various people, trying to verify whether this was a legitimate document or whether it was a hoax document that had been put out to the UFO community to try to throw people off the track, so to speak. Now what happened is Stan put it in a book, and this created a very difficult situation with Don Berliner. And this is a letter that was in the Stanton Friedman archives from Don Berliner, and I guess I'll read it. Aviation science writer, dear Stanton Friedman, I got a call from John White, who was trying to mediate the dispute between us regarding your completely unauthorized use of the text of the allegedly official MJ-12 field manual SOM-1. As this has not been shown to be a government document, and since the original source of it, such as government or private hoaxer, is unknown, it is my private property until proven otherwise. You were sent a copy for the express purpose of your trying to help determine its legitimacy, which neither you nor anyone else has yet done. You were told very clearly that any other use of it would have to be cleared by me, and you agreed. By publishing it in your new book, you have violated that agreement. Your action is unethical, nothing less. The fact that a few copies have been improperly distributed by agencies of the U.S. government has changed nothing. I find your behavior totally unacceptable, and it has now cost you a friend. One of the sort of a down moment for Stan, and there aren't many down moments for Stan, but it does have a positive part to it, because a lot of people believe that when people are getting these documents, that say Stan created this document, or Don Berliner did the document, or Bill Moore. And what you see when you look at the material that these people produce, this is behind the scenes, and you can see a very serious effort by a number of researchers trying to establish, is this a real document or is this not? So what it does establishes to me is the researchers who were doing these documents had nothing to do with producing the document. They were doing an honest job of trying to verify whether the document was a real government leak or whether it was a hoax. Now, throughout the 1980s, and I guess right through his whole career, Stan had a lot of encounters with skeptics, debates with skeptics, and through the various episodes that I'll do, and there are quite a few episodes I'm going to do, there'll be a lot where Stan is interacting with skeptics. He spent a lot of time doing this, and this would include, the main one was Phil Klass. He went up against James Oberg. He went up against Carl Sagan, the great Randy, all sorts of, Michael Shermer. Anybody that would try to put down UFOs, Stan would challenge them to a debate. And so a lot of the documents in the Stan Friedman collection are these interactions between him and skeptics. Now, the skeptics of today are still around, but it's a little bit different than it was in the 1980s, because now with skepticism, a lot of it's done on Facebook and it's very public, and a person will make a skeptical comment and other skeptics will jump in and they'll sort of jump all over the person who posted it. And it's a very ugly situation. In Stan's day, it was basically, you got to realize there was no internet. This was snail mail. These were letters going back and forth between believers and disbelievers. And what you had is a situation where there was no grandstanding in front of other people. These were private letters, but they were actually very, very, in some ways funny, very sharp criticisms, very, very intelligently written, because they were basically intended to try to actually win an argument. So I'm going to do a little bit today, and in other episodes, I will sort of mention the encounters that Stan had with these many skeptics. And as I said, some of these correspondences went on for like a decade between these people arguing back and forth. And a lot of the debate in the 1980s was about this MJ-12 document. And the main argument was taking place between Stanton Friedman, Bill Moore, and the skeptic was Phil Klass. And Phil Klass actually did a fair bit of research. It was surprising. Mostly today, people will just say, I don't believe it, prove it to me. You'll see if you go through the correspondence between Phil Klass and Stanton, and that it's an extensive amount of correspondence, which is only found in the Stanton Friedman archives. It's not in the Phil Klass archives. You will see this very sharply worded fighting back and forth about this MJ-12 document. This is one of the criticism that I found kind of funny. One of the people wrote a criticism criticizing his book, Secret Majestic, Operation Majestic 12. And Stanton writes, he says, in short, think it over, recognize the error of your ways, and apologize. So Stan was very short with these people. He was very smart the way he wrote it. But this is not Phil Klass, but this was a girl who had written a criticism, and he basically took the time to write her a letter and point out all the things that she had wrong, and then told her basically to apologize. Now, a lot of the criticism on the MJ-12 documents came to this document. This is called the Cutler-Twining memo. And a lot of people today will say, oh, we need providence. Like, for example, the Edgar Mitchell documents. Wow, we need providence. We need to prove providence. And in the end, providence doesn't prove anything. This one was brought right back to where it was found. They were getting what was called bird code, or messages from whoever had leaked the document, sort of giving the instructions as to where to go. And the way this was found is they said they received a message that said, for a good look, go to Sweetland, or Suitland. if you want a smart look, go to Suitland. So that was Suitland, Maryland, National Archives. And then they got a postcard from New Zealand from box, I think it was 189 in New Zealand. So they went there and they were looking through a series. They realized there was a series of Air Force top secret documents that had just been declassified. So Bill Moore and Jamie Chandray go there. And of course, in box 189, they find this Cutler-Twining memo, which is on onion skin paper. It's basically the paper that was used at that time. It has the little red mark through it for the declassification. It's stamped National Archives. So there is absolutely no doubt whatsoever that this document came from the National Archives. That didn't prove anything, because all the skeptics said is, well, they just took it in with them. They took it in a folder, because the folder that it was in, the box that it was in, the documents in that box had nothing to do with this document. But this is a document, an MJ-12 document from a National Archives. And I actually talked to the archivist at the archives, who was one of the guys who did the declassifications. And he had gotten involved not because he was really interested in UFOs. His girlfriend was very interested in UFOs. And she had seen this controversy about this document and had come to him and said, well, what do you think of this? And he got kind of interested. He thought, well, what's going on here? And when I had my meetings with him, I had a couple of meetings with him, and Ryan Wood had meetings with him. And he was pretty open to talking to us about what was going on behind the scenes. And he had made the fact that he had, one of the guys who was on the declassification teams claimed that he had seen MJ-12 documents in the Joint Chiefs of Staff files. So he was asking everybody, if you see an MJ-12 document, let me know. And he said if it was classified, he would withhold it. He would not break any laws, but if there was any reason that it should be declassified, he would release the document. And he said the MJ-12 was not one of the code names. It was not a name that they had to, it was not on the list. So he said it would be clear for him to release it. And he said that the way they were protecting this document inside the National Archives indicated that the National Archives thought this was real, that they had it in there's a certain way you protect it, you put it in plastic or however it was. He said the way they were protecting this document indicated that they were taking this document very seriously. But a lot of the correspondence going back between Phil Klass and Stanton Friedman argues about this. Why is there no signature on it? Robert Cutler was out of the country at the time. All these sort of debates, and this came down to this very special studies project meeting that took place where the MJ-12 got together and President Eisenhower ran this meeting. Now you can see Phil Klass, he starts attacking this document, and he says, you know, it's not possible. Robert Cutler could not have written the memo. It bears his type name because 11 days earlier, on July the 3rd, he had left Washington for a trip to visit military bases in North Africa. And then, of course, Stan would come back and say, there was a note there that said, keep the stuff moving out of my box. And therefore, they could keep moving the files through, just put his name on it. And so these debates went on for, as I said, like maybe a decade. This major debate went on between Stan Friedman and Phil Klass about particularly this one document and the big MJ-12 document, the Eyes Only, which was claimed to be a briefing document on the UFO situation for President Eisenhower that was prepared by President Truman. Now, this is one of the, and Phil Klass had kind of a sense of humor, which made it kind of good. He actually sends Stan a document, because one of the things came down to a document that had Harry Truman's signature on, that they claimed that they had just copied the signature and put it on another piece of paper. So he sends this document to Stan. This is a bogus document. It was prepared to show how easy it is to make such a counterfeit simply by using a photocopying machine and white paper and correction fluid. And so he sends this to Stan and says, you know, I can create these phony documents as well. And here's Stan writing back, and you can see these are very detailed things. They're going through, you know, how it worked, and your silly statement of February the 20th. You concoct a silly claim that I would believe that Ike would have sent a note to Cutler regarding Twining in the meeting. And this gets very detailed. It goes back and forth, and they're on these very things about the type of typewriter that was used. And it was tough reading, but everybody was watching this. It was sort of the story of the day, that this was all that was sort of in UFO magazines, this debate going back and forth as to whether this was a legitimate document. And like every other document, nothing was ever proved. So it really doesn't matter where you can bring a document back to say it was actually in an archives at one time. When people say they don't believe it, it basically is very hard to prove a document is real, even if you get it from the government. And you can see situations like that where the government sent, for example, when Steve Bassett got the 25,000 signatures for a petition, the White House put out an official statement in reply to his petition about disclosure, and said the government is not covering up anything. There's no proof of ETs. And it was a total outright lie. It was an official government statement. So it doesn't really matter where the document's coming from or where the statement's coming from. Really, in the end, not much is really provable in the UFO community when someone decides they want to believe or disbelieve. Now here is another letter. This is Stan writing. And what you would see is this calling each other by their first name, but then it actually changed, that they would actually use the first initial and the middle name. And it was like this thing to try to get under the other guy's skin. And you would see these little shots they were taking each other. And Stan actually talks about Phil Klass had just gone to China to lecture. And he basically says, regarding your letter of the May 30th, lots of good humor here for us insiders, like suggesting Moore and I don't know about FOIA. So what had actually happened here is Stan had actually written Phil Klass, and Phil Klass worked for aviation news and space technology in Washington, which was like an official leak magazine. When they would leak stuff about new aircraft and stuff, they would leak it to Aviation Week. And he was an editor there. So there was always this rumor that he worked for the CIA, and he had all these inside government sources. So in 1983, Stan got the word from whoever that he and Bill Moore were under investigation by the FBI. Now, this is before the MJ-12 document was leaked. So he'd actually written Phil Klass, and he said, you know, you got all your sources, your government sources. Can you talk to them as to why we're under investigation? And Phil Klass had actually written back and said, well, you should file an FOIA. You've been out of the country for so long, you probably don't know we got this FOIA. And that's where Stan is saying, well, you know, for us insiders, you know, it's pretty humorous that you would say we don't know about FOIA. And Phil Klass had just come out with a book. So there's this little shot at the end where he talks about Phil Klass's new book. He said, I must admire the double meaning of the title of your book. Associating the public deceived, which is the name of the book, with your name and UFOs certainly seems appropriate. The picture of you is a good one too. Nice suit too. Now here's where you see they start to use each other. They're sort of insulting each other just by using the names. So nothing really changes. UFO researchers have always fought, and they were fighting back in the 1980s. So instead of calling him Phil Klass, you'd call him P. Julian Klass, because Phil Klass would use Stanton's first middle name, Terrence. So you'd call him S. Terrence Friedman. And so Stan is talking about this trip to China. He says, pity I couldn't accommodate you to China to provide the facts about UFOs instead of your fiction. The book is loaded with misstatements and misrepresentations as expected. So he actually goes and he does a review, puts it in a magazine, and basically picks out all the mistakes in Phil Klass's book. And they would do this back and forth with each other's books. Here's another one where, let's see, why we got this. Oh yeah, this is an interesting document. This is a 1988 document. Now you got to realize the MJ-12 document was released in 1987, And what I didn't realize, like people ask me, what kind of surprises did you find in the Friedman library in his collection? This is one of the documents that sort of surprised me. What it indicates, the document was leaked in 1984 in December, went into Jamie Chandray's box. Bill Moore said Jamie Chandray believed had an intelligence background. That would explain why he had it instead of Bill Moore getting it. Stanton had just moved to New Brunswick on the other side of the country. And this document basically confirms that Stan, even though Stan was backing up when they released the document at the MUFON conference in Washington in 1987, Stan was on stage defending this document. He did not have a copy of the document. Bill Moore and Jamie Chandray had been researching the document since December of 1984. Stan had asked for a copy, and Bill Moore said it's too much. It's not safe to send you a document because you got to remember everything's being done by snail mail. So Stan, as you'll see here, he actually Phil Klass brings up the fact. He said, "You will recall that when you and I appeared on KSDO San Diego talk show on June the 22nd, 1987, you said, I got my first copy of the MJ-12 papers roughly 2.5 weeks ago." So Stan, and I didn't know this, I thought Stan had helped them research the document from 1984 on. He did not see the document until 2 weeks before it was actually made public. And there, as I've explained numerous times, the way the government forced the document out, because Bill Moore was not going to release it. They weren't prepared to know whether it was real or a fake document. So they were sitting on the document. And then the Falcon comes to Bill Moore and he said, you know, if you want to get credit for this document, you better release it because it's about to be released in England. And what the intelligence had done is leaked the same document to top UFO researcher Timothy Good, and Timothy Good was putting it in his book Above Top Secret. So Moore had to make a scramble. He had to run and he had to get the thing released. So that's when they took it to the MUFON conference to get it out about a week before the book came out in Great Britain. And they sort of got burned in that they didn't do enough research. The really bizarre part was, and I didn't realize this, Stan really didn't do any research on the document as well. So he sort of got stuck backing the document, and he really hadn't seen the document until 2.5 weeks before the actual conference when they released the document. Now, Stan Friedman, there's a lot, and I will probably do a whole bunch of episodes on Area 51. There's an awful lot of stuff on Area 51. I'm just going to do the one thing here, which is I found a lot of my stuff in Stanton Friedman's collection. This is a note that I sent to Stanton. I actually sent him 2 interviews that I did. Most people don't realize that when the MJ-12 story was breaking in 1989, 88 and 89, I was actually researching the story because we were putting together our book, UFOs, MJ-12 and the Government. I co-authored it with Scott Crane. And I had done 2 interviews. One was with Scott McKenzie, who I believe had done the interview or done the regression. He had done a hypnotic regression with Bob Lazar, and I asked him a bunch of questions. And basically his conclusion was whatever Bob Lazar is telling, whatever his story is, he believes it. And the other one was this Glenn Meek, who was, I think, with the competing TV station, and he didn't believe any of it. He was, so I had taken these 2 interviews, I transcribed them, and I sent them to Stan. And when I go to see his files, I find my note and the transcripts of the interviews that I had sent him back in 1989. Bill Moore and the CIA lawsuit. Bill Moore told a researcher by the name Bill Steinman that he had actually done some work for the CIA when he was at university. Bill was sort of a language expert. He could speak, read and write fluent French and Russian and English. And he claimed that he had done some papers or he'd helped out the CIA when he was at university, and that he really wasn't doing it anymore. But when he got into the UFO field, he went back and initiated his sources at the CIA to help him with working on UFOs. So what happens is the CAUS organization in Washington did a number of things. They did lawsuits against various agencies to get documents, and this is during the Carter administration, where a lot of the FOIA stuff came out. They also were very involved in the protest march for disclosure outside the White House. The one time that there was a big demonstration, and I don't believe they had more than 20 people there. But the guy that was running this whole thing was Larry Bryant. Larry Bryant was one of the more colorful characters in the UFO field. And what he would do is very bizarre things, anything to stir it up and to try to push documents out and get people to talk. He was actually taking ads out in military magazines. So he would get a magazine that was printed on, say, Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, and he would put an ad in the newspaper at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base or whatever base or government agency that he was targeting, and tell them we need whistleblowers to tell us about crash flying saucers and stuff like that. And he had the right to do it, but it was very controversial. They were trying to stop him. So one of the ideas he had sort of gotten was that he was going to do this lawsuit against all the intelligence agency. And Bill Moore told him, I'm on your board and I don't think it's a good idea. So he actually writes him. He said, I'm less happy, however, with your apparent decision to go ahead with this flamboyant lawsuit against the veritable alphabet soup of agencies. It is my very strong feeling that it is sheer folly to try to attempt a thing without proper planning and pinned only on the unfounded hope that something useful may emerge in the discovery process. With planning, and he says you should plan this thing because they were just sort of like throwing darts and hoping they hit something. And Bill Moore was very upset that they were doing this because he was on the board, and I guess he had these connections inside the government, and they were stirring up these agencies that Bill Moore was actually trying to get cooperation from and work with. This is Stanton's files with a guy named Coleman von Keviczky. Now, anybody who's in the 1980s will and did research will have a collection of research from Coleman von Keviczky, and I did as well. I actually interacted with von Keviczky. He was a major in the United Nations and was very vocal on UFOs, very vocal inside the United Nations on UFOs. And he would send material to all the various presidents and to the Secretary General at the UN, to any high powerful person that he could. And what he would do is he would attach a bunch of documents. And a lot of these documents I hadn't really seen before. So at one point, and here's von Keviczky, and I actually went and I was talking to Antonio Huneeus. Now, Antonio Huneeus was a researcher who worked for Open Minds magazine, was very prominent back in the 1980s, was in Stephen Bassett's Citizens Hearing. He was an expert. He spoke a number of different languages, followed French articles. He was from South America, so he would keep track of what was going on in all the South American countries. A very sort of prominent researcher. Actually, when the Rockefeller put his report together, Don Berliner was the first author of the Rockefeller report, and he actually got moved out, and they brought in Antonio Huneeus, and Antonio Huneeus added sections inside the Rockefeller report that he had produced for 1,000 high-level people, and this would include Secretary of Defense Laird, the Clintons, the ambassador to France. So Rockefeller produced these 1,000 reports and it was actually Antonio Huneeus who wrote the final report. Now, where it ties into von Keviczky is that at that time, Antonio was living in New York City, and so was von Keviczky. And I heard that von Keviczky had died and that the files were now open. And I was, of course, trying to find the files because I was researching the President of the United States. And I knew that von Keviczky had contacted every US president numerous times, and he had attached all these documents, and I wanted to see what kind of responses he was getting. So I went to Antonio Huneeus to get these files, and he said, no, they're gone. He said they were bought by Bob Bigelow. So he I went to Eric Davis, and at that time he was still the chief physicist for NIDS. And I went and I said, Bigelow has bought von Keviczky's files. I'm coming to Las Vegas. Can I look at the files? I'm only interested in the presidential stuff. I want to see what there is. And he said, no, they're not here. He doesn't have the files, von Keviczky's files. And I said, well, yeah, he's got them. I know he's got them because Antonio Huneeus told me he helped the wife pack the boxes. And that's who they sold them to. He knows exactly where they went. He sent them. And so he came back and he said, no, they're not here. Maybe they're at his private residence or whatever, but we don't have them. Now, in the latest Jacques Vallée book, you can actually see that Bigelow was buying up a bunch of collections. So Bigelow was, here you see Vallée pointing out that he had bought Ruppelt's papers, the U.S. Air Force head of Blue Book. He had purchased those papers, and he was trying to get the APRO papers, but that went nowhere. So he was buying up all these collections, which is fine. But the problem is that they seem to have gone into a black hole, that if you get these collections, it doesn't really help some rich guy to have them, or some group that's going to keep them to themselves. It only helps if these documents are made public. So that's why I'm going to try as much as I can with the Stanton Friedman documents to put as many of them out as possible. It really doesn't help me to get the documents and keep them in my little collection. It's the best is to get as many people to see as many documents as possible so people can use them to figure out what's going on. Now, a number of the other collections I've got a lot of collections. I've got the entire Senator Barry Goldwater collection of UFO documents, which is probably 180 pages. We'll put that out. I've got Scott Jones' collection. He was the assistant. He was one of the Avery, one of the Birds. He had worked for Senator Claiborne Pell and was an advisor on UFOs and paranormal phenomena for Claiborne Pell. I went to Rhode Island to look at his files. I've got a big collection of his files. I've got all of the Clinton files from the Clinton Library, although I haven't really read them. They seem pretty boring. I haven't really read them yet. And I have a collection by Frank Rand, which I'll sort of throw that out there. Frank Rand is kind of an important guy, but nobody will know who he is. He ended up dying and leaving a collection of papers, which I've got 1/3 of them, and hoping to get the rest. Is a very, very important collection of UFO documents. Now, here's one of the documents that von Keviczky sent. This is to Gerald Ford. And what he would do is get an article. So here he's referring to an article out of the National Enquirer, which was actually a pretty respectable UFO magazine at the time, or because Bob Pratt was working. And a lot of us worked with Bob Pratt. Stanton Friedman worked with him. I worked with him. He worked with MUFON. He was, because the National Enquirer had unlimited amount of money. And Bob Pratt would do these stories. He would go after all these big stories. And so they got this article out of the National Enquirer. And so what von Keviczky would do is he would send it to the president. Here he says it's Gerald Ford. And these letters would go on for 5 or 6 pages. And then it would have maybe 15 pages of documents. And a lot of these documents I really hadn't seen. And he was trying to get a reaction from Gerald Ford as to this article that has just appeared in the newspaper. He was also, von Keviczky was also tied in, for people who weren't around in the 1980s, they don't realize that Grenada was very much a pro-UFO country at the time. And their leader had an abduction experience, a UFO experience, was very interested. And so von Keviczky was really pushing Grenada. And what they were doing with Grenada is they were filing motions inside the United Nations, because of course the United States isn't going to file any UFO type motions. And so they were filing these motions for a Committee on Outer Space Studies and things like this. And they were filing it through the island of Grenada. Unfortunately, Grenada actually, Eric Gary, who was the leader who had had the experiences, was actually in Washington, or in New York at the UN when his country was overthrown by the communists. And there was stories going on at the time that this had actually been sort of approved by the Americans to try to get Gary out, because they were causing this huge amount of trouble with these UFO proposals that were being put through the United Nations. Another interesting story about Eric Gary was that it was actually sent to me by the archivist. People figure that archivists are guys who are trying to cover up. I was actually sent a document by an archivist at the Carter Library who had gone to school with Chip Carter and had heard Chip Carter tell the story about Jimmy Carter's UFO sighting. And he actually sent me the notes, which we hadn't found when I was at the library. He found them later and sent them to me. And this was the handwritten Jimmy Carter notes of the meeting with Eric Gary, and that they talked about UFOs, and they'd also talked about supernatural things. And these were Carter's handwritten notes. So Eric Gary actually had a meeting. And at the time when I was at the Carter Library, I couldn't get the records because they were still classified, top secret. And what I knew who was in the room, but we couldn't get the notes of that meeting. Now, they may have been declassified by now, but it was an interesting time in the 1980s with Grenada causing this great commotion at the United Nations and putting proposals, pro-UFO proposals, through that the United Nations or that the United States would continually try to block. This is an interesting article that I found. This is part of the collection, the von Keviczky collection at the Stanton Friedman Library. And these are, when you go through, this is what you'd find in von Keviczky's stuff. It wasn't so much that he got any responses from his letters, but it was the documents that he would attach. So here's a newsletter from Mexico City that he sends, and it basically talks about U.S. firing on UFOs. Now, this has to do with the 1942 overflight of Los Angeles, where they were shooting at this sort of a balloon object that was flying around there. This is what this article is about, but there's actually a little piece in the article that is very, very interesting. And I didn't notice this until I actually got home and was reading it. And I would find a lot of the stuff in von Keviczky's stuff. It's one chapter in the third section there. He said, President Harry S. Truman asked Albert Einstein for suggestions on the wave of UFO sightings over Washington in June and July of 1952. Einstein replied, do nothing. Do anything, but don't shoot. This is interesting because this is the first time I've ever heard this fact that Einstein had been contacted by Truman, because I've got an audio tape of a lecture given in 1956 in Detroit by Frank Edwards. And Frank Edwards was the coast to coast of the 1950s. He had 10 million listeners. And he claimed that he was working for Mutual Radio Network. He claimed he lost his job because he was talking too much about UFOs. He was very interested in UFOs. He'd written a couple of UFO books. And he tells the story. So here you have this one von Keviczky's article here that says there was a contact between Einstein and the president, and that Einstein had said, do anything, but don't shoot. The story that Frank Edwards tells is very similar, except it's a little bit different, but it's very similar. He said they tried to shoot down UFOs over Washington. They couldn't, and they still can't, basically because the UFOs are in control. And he said, but I know what Albert Einstein told the president, because there was this shoot down order. And according to him, Einstein had contacted Truman and said, Mr. Truman, anybody who can come across millions of miles of space will know what to do will know how to protect themselves once they get here. Don't start something you can't finish. And then Edwards said that was probably the first time that give him hell, Harry decided it'd be better not to give him any hell. So here you have almost a verification of the fact that Einstein and Truman had a meeting about these shoot down order over Washington, D.C. Because the reason I started the UFO thing with the presidents, I was looking for Dr. Eric Walker, who was former president of Penn State University, who was a key figure, who was involved, who knew what was going on, had indicated that his files might be sent to the Truman Library. So we were trying to find his UFO files, went to the Truman Library, and there was a couple of things from Walker, but really nothing significant. And it was at that point when I asked the Truman Library, I said, the president's the most important, most powerful man in the world. What does he know about the most important subject? What do you guys have on UFOs in the presidential archives for the Truman Library. And all they had was a bunch of telegrams that had been sent in July of 1952. So the first week, these UFOs flew over Washington, and then Truman gives the shoot down order. And all the newspapers pick it up, and all these telegrams start floating into the White House saying, don't shoot him down, don't shoot him down. And that was when this meeting supposedly took place between Einstein and Truman. But in the Truman Library, I could not find any reference to the fact that Einstein had any contact. He wasn't one of the telegrams. But here we have a second verification of the fact that there was actually a meeting between Albert Einstein and Harry Truman about the shoot down order of UFOs over Washington, D.C. in July of 1952. Now, here's another one, and I'll just quickly flip through some of these. He wrote a lot of, here's to Kurt Waldheim, the Secretary General. He's writing a letter and talking about the UFO forces. This is a threat to international security. We're trying to shoot these things down. This is a big problem. We have to do something about this. And most of the stuff, he really didn't get any sort of reaction to his letters. Here's another one he sends to Waldheim, again, talking about the importance of what we need to do. And he actually logged all this stuff. And I've got some of this in my files as well, where he would actually log who he was talking to, what the demand was, and what actually happened when he sent it out. He would say it was thwarted before the Congress, suppressed, no answer. And he was writing the Secretary General Stanton and Waldheim and the various presidents, and he was trying to engage the most powerful leaders of the world, and again would attach all these documents to it. Here's another one where he talks about the he had apparently a number of letters, a number of documents that talked about jet fighters trying to shoot down UFOs. An F-83 interceptor shot at a UFO. And then he talks about one from a source out of the Soviet Union, where July 24th, 1957, Russian anti-aircraft batteries opened fire on UFOs. So he had a lot of interesting stuff. He had a lot of connections through the UN and was producing these documents and making these very high-level contacts, trying to do disclosure. And this is back in the 1970s when he was done. But his files, his entire set of files is, I guess, as Bob Bigelow has them. Now here's Stanton talking about, he got a lot of correspondence. As you know, he co-authored a book on the Betty and Barney Hill abduction case. And Stan was sort of like gray basket on abduction cases. He'd always, you know, he said my white basket, my black basket, and I was a gray basket. But because he always said you needed concrete evidence, you needed something. And sort of these stories from abductees, there was really nothing you could actually measure and stuff. But the Betty Hill star map was something that Stan was very impressed with because it you know, had measurements and you had stuff. And he spent a lot of time arguing with various people, attacked him about the star map. And this is the star map that Betty Hill had gotten under regression. And so Stan took defense of regression and hypnotic regression to retrieve memory. So, and then Marguerite Fish had gone and taken this star map that Betty Hill had remembered under regression and actually did all the different stars and found actual stars that would fit into this. And that's where the Zeta Reticuli 2 comes from, with the origin of this. It came from this star map. And you can see if you go through, there's a whole pile of, like, Phil Klass attacked him. And Phil Klass was saying her search the stars, and Stan was saying no, it was all known stars in your quotes. So they were fighting about this. Was it all stars that have intelligent life, or was it all stars? And then Sagan got involved, and Stan went after Sagan and claimed that he was very embarrassed that he'd gone to school with Sagan, and I can't believe you're doing this. You know, I'm embarrassed to say I've gone to school with you. And it was this real battle back and forth with these snail mail things. Now I'll end with this. And anybody who was in the 1980s knew about this magazine. It was called Saucer Smear. Every month you'd wait for this thing because it was a very, very funny magazine. It was run by James Mosley, he called himself the editor and supreme commander of the magazine. And for him, anything that was a joke was good. I mean, he liked to play jokes. He was a very funny guy. And he was sort of played skeptic, but you didn't know whether he was skeptic or whatever. And he would basically do this magazine, which was very funny reading. And so you'd get the magazine every month and you would be anxious to read it. And then you'd pick it up and hope the hell you weren't in it, because everybody got skewered in this magazine. So, and a lot of the correspondence would go through. You'd have a lot of people fighting. Stan would publish in here. Bill Moore would publish letters to the editor. And you would have these people having these UFO battles in the letters to the editor in this magazine. So you can see here, Saucer Smear, it was $1 volunteer. You could send in $1 and he would send you your thing. And he actually has this thing. If Phil Klass didn't exist, ufologists would have to invent him. Here's one. He wrote an editorial, and he would have things like this in his editorial. As you will see, if you have the heart to read into the letter section, Klass has achieved what only a great leader can do: to have everyone agree at least about one thing. Of course, the one thing they agree upon is that Klass is the epitome of the anti-everything. So he goes after Klass, and then he talks about, he disagrees with Klass, was always talking about UFO people were being like communists, and the government was telling the truth and all this kind of stuff. And if you were anti-government, you were a communist and stuff. So Mosley's writing in his editorial, he said, I don't really agree with his political stance, nor even his militant debating tactics. But for the one thing so terrible, so unthinkable, that only the fearless editor of Saucer Smear would dare state it in print, we refer to the possibility, however remote, that Klass may be right in his theses that flying saucers are a crock of shit. We are, of course, paraphrasing him, as Klass is too nice a gentleman to use such language. So it was this kind of magazine where anything sort of went, if it was a joke, he would put it in there. Here he's talking about the MUFON, I believe this 84 MUFON conference or 83, where it's supposed to be going to Dallas. And he writes in here, he says, the conference was originally to be held, but the MUFON hardcore in the Dallas group voted somewhat mysteriously not to sponsor the event. So here you have this thing where we talk about MUFON fighting today, or all of it was fighting. It's the same thing in 1983. Although all details of this fascinating situation have not yet been revealed to us, we do have some interesting, an interesting anomalous letter from a disgruntled lead member of the Dallas MUFON chapter stating, among other things, that Walt Andrus was the head of MUFON at the time, Walt Andrus has acted in a very unprofessional and deceptive manner. The anonymous writer goes on to say that Walt Andrus has explicitly made it clear that there is some excellent UFO data that comes into MUFON offices, which will never be made available to the members of the public. Shades of censorship here. The writer concludes by saying, I really don't know what Walt Andrus would, I personally don't think Walt Andrus would know what to do with a UFO if it was to sit down in his own backyard. Knowing Walt as I do, he would probably say to the occupants that they were a figment of his imagination. So you can see this humorous part of his magazine, and the fact that the MUFON people were fighting back 25 years ago or 35 years ago, the same as they are right now. Now I'm going to end with this because this is an interesting letter. This is from Bill Steinman, who was a colleague of mine. He actually got sort of spooked by the UFO phenomena, thought he was being threatened, actually pulled out. And he's the guy that actually sort of got me going on the Dr. Hawk, read the letter to the editor that he writes. And he's sort of very angry with the way that he's been treated in the magazine. He's basically saying he's very disappointed that Mosley could indicate that he was hoaxing the letter from a very well-known scientist. Now, the scientist he's referring to is Dr. Robert Saubacher. So the Canadians write a top secret memo in which they're told by the Americans that UFOs are real, flying saucers are real. It's the most highly classified subject in the United States. There's a small group headed by Dr. Vannevar Bush who are trying to figure out what's going on, and the subject is of tremendous significance to the Americans. Most of that material came from Dr. Robert Saubacher. So we find that out through Stanton Friedman and through Bill Steinman. So Steinman writes Saubacher to confirm this. He said, did you provide the Canadians with this material? And Saubacher writes back this letter to Bill Steinman. But of course, Saucer Smear basically starts off by saying, this is a hoax. Steinman made up the document. So he's saying that this well-known scientist, in reference to verification of a government recovery of crashed flying saucers, and this was, Saubacher said he had been invited to a crash meeting at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in 1950. He couldn't go, but Dr. Eric Walker had gone. You knew, as you asserted, the phrase former Zeckel associate. So you have Todd Zeckel, I won't get into it. So they've tied his name in with Todd Zeckel, and that's going to discredit him. So that people reading Smear would doubt the whole thing. Did you present my letter in a manner, in that manner, just because I wouldn't send you a copy of the letter from the scientist? How childish! Shame on you. The purpose of my sending a letter to you, telling you of the letter from the scientist, was for public information purposes. I cannot and will not send a copy of that letter to you. The reason is that there are too many rumors floating around about your intelligence department ties, and I have to protect my source. He really stuck his neck out, telling me all this information and signing his name to it. I don't want to get his neck on the chopping block, even though he doesn't seem too worried about the situation. In fact, he didn't care at all. He wasn't scared about, he said, I'll just tell you what happened. I think that he is naive about the current classification of the subject matter. He told me that it was the most highly classified subject matter in the United States government in 1950. So you see, Jim, I do have the letter. The scientist did verify the flying saucer recoveries. The man is in a top scientific position, and he has to be protected for his own good, whether he realizes it or not. I shared the information with Bill Moore and Stanton Friedman because I believe I can trust them. In fact, Stan has had a personal interview with the scientist. That interview is on my White House UFO YouTube channel. It's a phone conversation between Stanton Friedman and Robert Saubacher. I recovered the tape, and I believe I have it. I produced the audio interview, Stanton interviewing this scientist who was invited to Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in 1950 with recovery of a flying saucer. I know that Moore lives off his books and his lectures, etc., but he himself and Friedman have one common goal: to solve the flying saucer enigma, not to propagate the mystery and to add to confusion on the matter. So, of course, what is Mosley's response? From other sources, we have received information downgrading the importance of the supposedly sensational letter Mr. Steinman claims to have received. Therefore, we stick to our comments in the last smear. And that's the way it was. Mosley would do whatever he wanted. He would say whatever he wanted. And if he could get a joke in, he would do it. So I'll leave it at that for episode 3, and we'll go to episode 4. And there'll be a lot less document discussion in episode 4. Thanks for listening.